1942. In 9 months, the United States Army built a city of 75,000 people in the hills of Tennessee. The city did not appear on any map. It consumed 1/7 of all the electricity produced in America. It borrowed 14,700 tons of silver from the U.S. Treasury because copper was scarce, and almost no one who lived there knew what they were building. Today, in 2025, California has been trying to build 171 miles of high-speed rail for 17 years. The project has consumed over $15 billion. Not a single passenger has taken a ride. The original completion date was 2020. The current estimate is 2030. Maybe. This is the K25 building. Or rather, this is where it used to stand. In 1944, K25 was the largest building on Earth. 44 acres under one roof, half a mile long, shaped like a massive U, along the banks of the Clinch River. It contained over 5 million square feet of floor space. The 4-story structure housed thousands of cascades of pipes and pumps designed to separate atoms that differed in weight by less than 1%. Construction began in September 1943. The building was operational by March 1945, 18 months from breaking ground to splitting atoms. In 2013, the last section of K25 came down. The demolition took 5 years and cost $1.1 billion, more than twice what the original building cost to construct. In inflation-adjusted terms, the concrete slab remains. A viewing tower stands nearby. Signs explain what once was, but the building itself is gone. Here is what they accomplished in those 18 months, in 1943 and 1944. Workers excavated 4.4 million cubic yards of earth, enough to fill a hole the size of 40 football fields, 60 feet deep. They poured 620,000 cubic yards of concrete. They laid 200 miles of roads. They built a coal-fired power plant with 8 generators producing 235,000 kilowatts. At the time, one of the largest in America. They did this while simultaneously building 3 other massive industrial facilities and an entire city to house the workers. At peak construction in mid-1944, over 75,000 workers were on site. By May 1945, the population of Oak Ridge had surged to 75,000 residents, making it the 5th largest city in Tennessee, a city that had not existed 3 years earlier, a city that still did not appear on any map. But scale is only part of the story. Speed is impressive. Scale is impressive. What makes Oak Ridge genuinely astonishing is what they accomplished without computers, without digital communications, without modern logistics software, without GPS, without the internet, without cell phones, without drones, without 3D modeling, without laser surveying. In 1943, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, the architectural firm tasked with designing the city, received some aerial photographs and a few topographical maps. They were not told where the site was located. They were given weeks, not years, to design a city for 30,000 people. When the population estimate was revised upward to 45,000, then 75,000, they simply expanded the design on the fly. The entire 400-person firm relocated to Tennessee. They worked out of temporary offices. They produced drawings on paper. They coordinated with slide rules and telephones. And they built one of the fastest and most skillful jobs of town planning in American history. The physics problem at Oak Ridge was not merely difficult. It was attempting something that had never been done at industrial scale, separating uranium isotopes. Natural uranium contains 2 primary isotopes, uranium-238 and uranium-235. They are chemically identical. The only difference is weight. U-235 is slightly lighter, by about 1.3%. But only U-235 can sustain a nuclear chain reaction, and natural uranium is 99.3% U-238. The bomb-grade material needed to be enriched to over 80% U-235. Imagine a jar filled with 993 white marbles and 7 blue marbles. Now imagine the marbles are the same size. the same texture, and nearly the same weight. Your task is to separate out the blue ones, not by color, since you cannot see color at the atomic level, but by weight alone. And you need to do this not with a handful of marbles, but with billions upon billions of atoms. This was the physics boss fight. Nature itself was the enemy. The laws of thermodynamics, the behavior of gases, the properties of materials, all conspiring against separation. And the margin for error was measured in thousandths of an inch. They attacked the problem from 3 directions at once. This was not efficiency. It was desperation. The Y-12 plant used electromagnetic separation, calutrons, named after the University of California cyclotrons that inspired them. Electrically charged uranium atoms were sent through a magnetic field. The lighter U-235 atoms curved slightly more than the heavier U-238 atoms. Collectors caught the separated streams. It was like sorting mail by weight, using only magnets. Construction of Y-12 began in February 1943. By the end of the war, the plant contained 1,152 calutrons arranged in giant oval racetracks. Peak employment reached 22,000 workers. The calutrons required massive electromagnets. Electromagnets require copper wire, but copper was desperately scarce in wartime America. The solution was audacious. Colonel Kenneth Nichols went to the U.S. Treasury and asked to borrow silver. The conversation, as Nichols recalled it, went like this. The Treasury official asked, "How much do you need?" Nichols replied, 6,000 tons. The official asked, "How many troy ounces is that?" Nichols admitted he did not know how to convert tons to troy ounces. Neither did the Treasury official. "I don't know how many troy ounces," Nichols said, "but I know I need 6,000 tons. That is a definite quantity." Eventually, 14,700 tons of silver bullion, 430 million troy ounces, worth over $600 million, were transported from the West Point Bullion Depository to Oak Ridge. The silver was cast into strips, wound into electromagnetic coils, and installed in the calutrons. After the war, the silver was recovered. Less than 0.036% was lost. When workers had to drill holes in the silver bars, they did so over paper to catch the filings. The K-25 plant used gaseous diffusion. Uranium hexafluoride gas was forced through barriers with microscopic pores. The lighter U-235 molecules passed through slightly more readily than the heavier U-238 molecules, but the separation factor was minuscule. Each stage enriched the uranium by only a tiny fraction of a percent. The process required over 3,000 stages connected in cascades. The barriers were the critical component. They needed pores measured in millionths of an inch, uniform across thousands of square feet. The manufacturing tolerance was unprecedented. The materials science was pushing the edge of what was known about metallurgy and chemistry. Construction began before the design was complete. They had no choice. The deadline was the end of the war. The alternative was that Germany might get there first. So they broke ground and figured out the details as they went. Then there was S-50. In June 1944, with both Y-12 and K-25 struggling to produce enough enriched uranium, the Manhattan Project received help from an unexpected source, the U.S. Navy. Physicist Philip Abelson had developed a different approach: liquid thermal diffusion. The process was simple. 3 concentric pipes, steam in the middle, cooling water on the outside, uranium hexafluoride in between. The light isotope rises toward the heat. The heavy isotope sinks toward the cold. General Leslie Groves ordered a production plant built at Oak Ridge. He gave the contractor, H.K. Ferguson Company of Cleveland, 90 days. Not 90 days to design a plant. 90 days to build it and have it operational. The S-50 plant was completed in 69 days. 2,142 columns, each 48 feet tall. perfect copper tubing inside nickel tubes. The distance between inner and outer tubes had to be precisely 0.025 centimeters, less than 1/100th of an inch. Operators began enriching uranium on September 16, 1944, while construction crews were still finishing the building around them. As Abelson later reflected, it was a really remarkably fast thing to start from nothing, and to do it during wartime. A large component in achieving this fast construction had to be General Groves. He really drove these people to get things constructed, sometimes by stepping on people's toes or hurting feelings, but the job was always done. Congressional testimony later concluded that S-50 shortened World War II by 7 days. The cost of the war was approximately $1 billion per day. The plant cost $20 million to build. But the speed came at a price, and the price was measured in more than dollars. The workers who built and operated Oak Ridge lived under conditions that modern Americans would find intolerable. They worked 6 days a week, often 7. Shifts ran around the clock, 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The town was permanently covered in mud. Roads were unpaved, dust in summer, muck in winter. Boardwalks were laid between buildings so workers could walk without sinking. Housing was whatever could be built fastest. Cemesto houses, prefabricated panels of cement and asbestos, were the premium option. Below that were trailers. Below that were dormitories. And at the bottom were hutments, 16 by 16-foot plywood shacks with a coal stove in the center, and no plumbing. Rent was 20 cents a day. The workers who lived in the hutments were predominantly black. Oak Ridge was a segregated city, built by the U.S. Army in the Jim Crow South. Black workers, even those with advanced degrees, were relegated to the worst housing, separated by gender. Married couples could not live together. Black women lived in a fenced area the residents called the pen. Guards were stationed outside, officially for protection. Curfews were enforced. Bed checks were unannounced. Catty Strickland came to Oak Ridge from Auburn, Alabama, with her husband Willie. She worked as a janitor in K-25, earning more than twice what she could make back home. She thought she was rich, she later said. All that money, but she could not live with her husband. Her children stayed in Alabama with their grandmother because black children were not permitted in Oak Ridge until after the war. She did not know what K-25 was for. None of them did. The workers called it the Secret City. The official name was the Clinton Engineer Works, after the nearby town of Clinton. But Oak Ridge was chosen for the township in 1943, selected from employee suggestions because it sounded rural and would hold outside curiosity to a minimum. The secrecy was total. The site was surrounded by fences and checkpoints. Armed guards monitored all traffic. Every resident over age 12 was required to wear a photo identification badge at all times. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Workers were forbidden from discussing their jobs even with their spouses. Billboards throughout the site carried messages. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here. Another simply showed a pair of ears with the warning, "The enemy is listening." Most workers had no idea what they were building. The Calutron operators at Y-12, predominantly young women, fresh out of high school, recruited by Tennessee Eastman, were trained to watch dials and turn knobs. Keep the needle in the center. If it moves right, turn left. If it moves left, turn right. If it sparks, call the supervisor. They were called the Calutron girls, and they outperformed the physicists at running the machines because they followed instructions exactly, rather than trying to understand and optimize. Gladys Owens was a Calutron operator. 50 years later, on a public tour of the facility, she saw a photograph of herself at her panel during the war. That was the first time she understood what her job had actually been. The organizational structure that made this possible would be illegal today. General Leslie Groves ran the Manhattan Project with authority that no civilian project manager has possessed before or since. He reported directly to the Secretary of War. He could commandeer materials, override contracts, conscript labor, seize land, and classify anything he wished. When the governor of Tennessee was presented with a proclamation declaring Oak Ridge a total exclusion area, meaning no one could enter without military permission, the governor angrily tore it up. The proclamation was enforced anyway. Land acquisition took 6 months. About 1,000 families lived in the area that became Oak Ridge. Many came home to find eviction notices nailed to their doors. Others learned the news when their children came home from school with messages from the principal. Senator McKellar wants me to tell you to go home and tell your parents you are going to have to find another place to live. There was no further explanation. Some families were given 2 weeks to vacate farms their families had owned for generations. The average price paid was $47 per acre. Protests, legal appeals, and a congressional inquiry were to no avail. Decision-making speed was measured in hours, not months. When Groves decided the S-50 thermal diffusion plant should be built, construction began within weeks. When the Calutrons needed silver, Nichols walked into the Treasury and walked out with a commitment for 14,700 tons. When design problems emerged, engineers solved them on-site rather than submitting change orders through procurement committees. There were no environmental impact statements, no public comment periods, no historic preservation reviews, no permits from multiple overlapping agencies, no litigation from affected parties, no transparency requirements. The cost of this speed was borne by the families who lost their land, by the workers who lived in mud and breathed asbestos, by the black families who lived behind fences, and by the communities who would spend decades dealing with contaminated soil and groundwater. This is what it meant to build at war speed. This is what we gained. This is what we lost. On August 6, 1945, President Truman addressed the nation by radio. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. The bomb's fissile material, the uranium-235, came from Oak Ridge. Workers throughout the site gathered around radios. For the first time, they learned what they had been building. The Calutron girls discovered they had been separating uranium isotopes. The construction workers learned their buildings had been factories for apocalyptic weapons. The janitors who swept floors at K-25 learned they had been maintaining the largest industrial facility in human history. Catty Strickland, the black janitor who had been cleaning offices without knowing why, heard the news and understood. She had helped end the war. She had helped build the bomb. The feelings were complicated. Pride mixed with horror. Relief mixed with guilt. The secret city was no longer secret, but the city remained. The K-25 building stood for nearly 7 decades after the war. It enriched uranium for the Cold War nuclear arsenal. It provided fuel for the first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, and the first commercial nuclear power plant at Shippingport, Pennsylvania. Gaseous diffusion became the dominant enrichment technology, and K-25 was the prototype for plants at Paducah, Kentucky, and Portsmouth, Ohio. Operations ceased in 1985. The building was shut down in 1987, and then the question became, what do you do with the largest building in the world, contaminated with decades of uranium processing? The answer took 26 years. Environmental assessments, remediation plans, decontamination procedures, regulatory approvals. In 2008, demolition finally began. Workers dismantled the building piece by piece, cataloging and disposing of each component according to its contamination level. Some materials went to the Department of Energy's nuclear landfill in Oak Ridge. The most hazardous waste was shipped to the Nevada National Security Site for desert burial. The demolition was completed in 2013. The total cost exceeded $1 billion. The K-25 History Center opened in 2020. It contains 7,500 square feet of exhibits with more than 250 original artifacts. Nearly 1,000 oral histories were collected over a 10-year span from former Manhattan Project and Cold War workers. Visitors can see Calutron panels, identification badges, safety equipment, and photographs by Ed Westcott, the only photographer authorized to document the secret city during the war. The concrete slab where K-25 stood is part of the Manhattan Project National Historical Park, established in 2015. The park encompasses sites in Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford. The mission is to preserve and interpret the history of atomic development. What K-25 accomplished in 18 months now takes years to explain. Let us speak plainly about what has changed. In 1970, President Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of proposed actions prior to making decisions. The law was a response to genuine problems. Rivers catching fire, cities choking on smog, toxic dumping poisoning communities. The Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969 galvanized public support. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had awakened environmental consciousness. NEPA was passed with bipartisan support. NEPA created the Environmental Impact Statement, a comprehensive review analyzing the effects of a proposed action and its alternatives. For major infrastructure projects, an EIS is now standard. The average completion time before recent reforms was 4.5 years. Critical projects like electrical transmission lines often took longer. A wind farm proposed for Cape Cod was canceled after 16 years of NAPA-related litigation. Transmission lines necessary for clean energy transition have been blocked or delayed for years. The California High-Speed Rail project has faced multiple lawsuits under the California Environmental Quality Act, the state equivalent of NEPA, contributing to delays and cost overruns. The irony is substantial. Laws designed to protect the environment now delay the construction of wind farms, solar installations, and electric rail, precisely the infrastructure needed to address climate change. Laws designed to give communities voice in development decisions now enable wealthy property owners to block housing construction, contributing to homelessness and unaffordability. Before 1970, an engineer could begin construction within weeks of approval. After 1970, approval itself became a multi-year process requiring multiple agencies, public comment periods, and potential litigation. Before 1970, environmental damage was often ignored, and communities were bulldozed without consent. After 1970, projects that would benefit millions can be blocked by the objections of dozens. The workers of 1943 deserved protection. The black families in the hutments deserved dignity. The farm families, forced off their land, deserved fair compensation and genuine choice. The environmental contamination at Oak Ridge, which required decades and billions to remediate, should never have occurred. But we have overcorrected into paralysis. Consider the numbers. In 1943, the United States began building Oak Ridge. 9 months later, there was a city of 75,000 people, 3 uranium enrichment plants under construction, and a graphite reactor going critical. In 2008, California voters approved bond funding for high-speed rail between Los Angeles and San Francisco. The original estimate was $33 billion and completion by 2020. 17 years later, in 2025, no passenger has ridden the train. The current cost estimate exceeds $128 billion. The most optimistic completion date is 2030 for a truncated segment in the Central Valley, not the Bay Area to Los Angeles promised to voters. The California High-Speed Rail Authority has spent over $15 billion. In early 2024, the first construction package, 22.5 miles in the Central Valley, reached substantial completion. Not operational, not carrying passengers, just substantially complete structurally. In 1944, Oak Ridge workers built the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, the largest building on Earth, with over 5 million square feet of floor space and technology that had never existed at industrial scale. In 18 months, California has been working on 171 miles of track for 17 years. The defenders of the current system say, safety requires review. Accountability requires process. Community input requires time. All of this is true, and all of it can be true while also being weaponized to block any project that anyone objects to for any reason. The California high-speed rail project was delayed by lawsuits from farmers challenging eminent domain. It was delayed by environmental groups challenging the route. It was delayed by communities challenging station locations. It was delayed by utilities challenging the relocation of power lines. Each lawsuit had merit from someone's perspective. Each lawsuit added months or years. The project started construction before design was complete, not from urgency, but from legal necessity. Federal funding had spending deadlines. If California did not break ground by a certain date, the money would disappear. So they broke ground without knowing the final design. And then, when designs changed, they faced costly change orders and additional delays. The average environmental impact statement at the federal level takes 4.5 years. The actual construction of infrastructure can begin only after approval. If the EIS is challenged in court, and for controversial projects, it usually is, add more years. If the challenge succeeds and the EIS must be revised, start the clock again. In 1944, General Groves told H.K. Ferguson to build the S-50 thermal diffusion plant in 90 days. Ferguson built it in 69 days. Today, the environmental review alone for a plant of that scale would take years. Here is the uncomfortable question. Oak Ridge was built by authoritarian methods. Land was seized. Workers were surveilled. Communities were bulldozed. Black families were segregated behind fences. Environmental contamination was ignored. The people who made the decisions were accountable to almost no one. And it worked. It ended the war. It may have saved millions of lives, Japanese and American alike, by avoiding an invasion of the Japanese home islands. It established American technological supremacy for a generation. It created the nuclear deterrent that, for all its horrors, has prevented great power war for 80 years. California high-speed rail is being built by democratic methods. There are public hearings, environmental reviews, community input, legal challenges, transparent budgets, elected officials accountable to voters, and it has not worked. 17 years and counting, billions spent, no passengers carried. Is democracy simply incompatible with major infrastructure? Is speed possible only under wartime authority? Must we choose between tyranny that builds and freedom that dithers? The honest answer is, we do not know. Other democracies build infrastructure faster than America. Japan built the Shinkansen, the original bullet train, in 5 years, from 1959 to 1964. France built the TGV network in the 1980s. Spain has built more high-speed rail than any country outside China. These are democracies with environmental laws and community input. But they have something America lacks: institutional capacity. They have agencies that know how to build. They have civil servants with experience managing large projects. They have legal frameworks that balance review with execution. They have cultures that expect construction, not obstruction. America once had this capacity. The interstate highway system was built in about 35 years. Over 48,000 miles of road transformed the nation. The Hoover Dam took 5 years from appropriation to completion. The Empire State Building took 410 days from start of construction to opening. The Golden Gate Bridge took just over 4 years. And Oak Ridge, a city and industrial complex that helped win a world war, took less than 3 years from first land acquisition to operational uranium enrichment. That capacity did not vanish because Americans became stupider or lazier. It vanished because we built systems optimized to prevent bad things rather than enable good things. Every regulation, every review, Every approval requirement exists because something went wrong, and someone decided, never again. We have accumulated never again for decades. The result is paralysis. The X-10 graphite reactor still stands at Oak Ridge. It went critical in November 1943, the first reactor to produce plutonium outside a laboratory. The technology developed there formed the foundation for the massive production reactors at Hanford. The reactor was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1966. You can visit it today. Tours are available through the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. You can see the loading face where workers inserted uranium slugs. You can see the control room where physicists monitored the chain reaction. You can stand where Enrico Fermi stood, calculating and adjusting, pulling the future into being. The reactor operated for 20 years, until 1963. It produced not just plutonium, but isotopes for medical research, materials for scientific experiments, and knowledge that shaped the nuclear age. After decommissioning, it was preserved rather than demolished, a monument to what was possible when urgency overcame inertia. The concrete is cracked now, the paint is faded, the instruments are antiquated, but the reactor stands. It will stand for centuries unless someone deliberately tears it down. The structure has outlasted its creators, outlasted the war it helped win, outlasted the Cold War that followed. The workers who built it are almost all gone now. The physicists who ran it have passed away. The Calutron girls have aged and faded. The memories are preserved in oral histories and museum exhibits and tours for school children. What will future generations say of us? In 1943, America faced an existential threat and responded by building the impossible. Cities from nothing, industrial plants from farmland, technologies from theory. The secret city emerged from secrecy and changed the world. In 2025, America faces existential threats and responds by studying them, analyzing them, holding hearings about them, commissioning reports, conducting reviews, litigating. Climate change requires new energy infrastructure. We cannot build transmission lines. Housing shortages require new construction. We cannot permit apartments. Transportation congestion requires new transit. We cannot complete a rail line. We have better tools than 1943. We have computers and GPS and 3D modeling and instant communication and artificial intelligence. We have wealth beyond anything the wartime generation could have imagined. We have knowledge and expertise and experience. But we have lost the will to use them. The concrete slab at K25 will be there for a long time. Concrete lasts. The viewing tower will need maintenance. The History Center will need funding, but the slab will endure. Visitors will come and read the signs and watch the videos and try to understand. They will learn about gaseous diffusion and uranium enrichment and the race for the bomb. They will see photographs of the building that was once the largest on Earth, and perhaps some of them will ask, could we do that again? If we truly had to? If the alternative was defeat? The workers of 1943 would say, of course you can. We did it. We were not supermen. We were farmers and secretaries and high school graduates. We worked hard and followed orders and got the job done. But we would need to want it. We would need to decide. We would need to accept trade-offs that have become unacceptable. We would need to tell some people no so that we could tell the nation yes. The question is not whether we can build. The question is whether we will choose to. The secret city is not secret anymore. The gates came down in March 1949. The fences were removed. The checkpoints closed. Oak Ridge is an ordinary Tennessee city now. Population 31,000. It has schools and churches and shopping centers and traffic lights. The federal facilities still operate. Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the Y-12 National Security Complex. But they are no longer building atomic bombs. They do materials research and supercomputing and nuclear security work. The mud is gone. The hutments were torn down decades ago. The boardwalks gave way to paved sidewalks. The Semesto houses still stand in some neighborhoods, architectural relics of emergency construction. You can drive through Oak Ridge and barely notice its history. Just another American town in the hills of Appalachia, on the banks of the Clinch River, under the oak-covered ridges that gave it its name. But in 1943, this was the center of the most ambitious construction project in human history. A city conjured from farmland, a workforce assembled from across the nation, technologies invented and scaled in months, problems solved by sheer will because there was no time for anything else. They built it because they had to, because the alternative was unthinkable, because the war demanded it. What will we build when we decide we have to? What will we build when we finally accept there is no alternative? What will we build when we are ready to choose? The concrete slab at K25 waits for an answer.